Greetings, everyone. We are coming at you week 6 of the fall semester in our persuasion class. This is the end of our second unit on formal and explicit modes of persuasion. So we started off talking about like logic and arguments, and then we moved into campaign communications. And you can think about a campaign as fairly structured, fairly intentional and systematic and planned and researched, and it's kind of coherent and designed and all the rest of it, right? And we also want to look at this business of social movements in this unit, and everything in this course is moving from the more rigid, the more formal, the more explicit, more official, to the less. So every week, things are going to get a little looser. They're going to get a little bit more complex and dynamic. And the basic logic of the progression in this class is to try to help us see persuasion as, first of all, just what we think it is. Arguments, logic, reasons, political this and that, campaigns. We're familiar with that stuff. But we can also see persuasive dynamics, forces, processes, patterns, and so on in modes and in mediums where we might not usually think about it too much. And that's where the class is kind of headed, to hopefully provide a total portrait of persuasion as such, or suasion, this idea of kind of moving bodies through the use of symbolic means, through arguments, through appeals of all kinds. We're going to look at some interesting stuff today on social movements. So hopefully you're tracking, what the progression, or maybe it's the regression of the ways in which persuasion comes at us, right? And so social movement is a really important phenomenon, topic, thing to consider. For a number of years, I taught a course in our department on the public sphere. The title of the class is the public communication, and I taught it as a class on the public sphere, which I think is a really important class that intersects with this idea of social movements, right? They're very similar, but not exactly the same. In any case, when we think about social movements, just go back to the founding of the nation, or go further back. I mean, when we think about important social developments, progressive changes, when we think about important accomplishments, justice-seeking movements, when we look for, positive changes in how we treat each other, or how we handle conditions that other people have to live in, or whatever, we often usually go to this thing of social movements, right? So it's important to be kind of thinking about social movements in a class on persuasion, because social movements are nothing without persuasion. So the whole thing is this mass, I think of social movements as a kind of like a storm that's kind of rolling across the landscape, and it's trying to kick up the old stuffy, stodgy ways of doing things or thinking, and sort of revise or renovate or replace, reform, revolutionize, right? Change. We're trying to move things in a better direction, in a more humane direction, in a safer, fairer direction, whatever change we're thinking about, right? So whatever you might have interests of your own in causes or social issues or whatever, chances are there's a social movement out there that's trying to advocate on behalf of that cause. One of the biggest ones that we can probably point to right now is the environmental movement, which has been kicking up steam ever since probably the 1960s, thereabouts, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, in terms of thinking about the environment as something to be concerned about, and trying to be getting other people to be concerned about how we're treating it and the consequences of our wastefulness and all the pollutants that we throw out into the atmosphere and in the waterways and so on. we could point to that as this gigantic storm that's trying to, storm maybe a bad word there because we're dealing with storms. That's part of the problem we're trying to solve here. But social movement itself is this just kind of like flurry of activity, and it's trying to use persuasion all around to try to like reach different audiences and affect change, right? Enact new ways of doing things. And so social movements are important, but they're also really kind of hard to get your arms around, right? Because, you know, where do they begin? Who's responsible? And, you know, where is it at any given time? How big is it? How small is it? How fast is it moving? What are its resources? These are like always kind of open questions. Nevertheless, we're going to try to kind of move through some of these questions and come up with something that we can grasp onto as a way to think about social movements rhetorically, persuasively, and some of the key parts there. So this week we're going to be looking at Herbert Simon's essay in the Quarterly Journal of Speech. If you're not aware, Quarterly Journal of Speech is the biggest, most important journal in rhetoric, probably in the world, certainly in this country. It's the oldest journal in the field of communication that's devoted to rhetoric and the study of rhetoric. And this piece comes from 1970, so I was not even born yet. This is, 5 decades plus ago. And there's some stuff in here that's definitely shows the marks of its age. But there's still some useful ways of thinking about movements and rhetoric and persuasion that I'm just going to try to thread together here. And the copy that I have does not have page numbers on it, so I'm just using the first page as the first number 1, 2, 3, all the way through. So I've noted that on the notes. I've got my notes right here, and I will mention this in an email as well, but we're not going to be doing the other reading that was supposed to come out of this book here on social movements, because I just read them both back to back, and they're essentially the same thing. So it looks like we're just going to have the Simons reading this week. And so let's launch in. By the way, Herbert Simons just passed just a few months ago. He had been in the field writing, well, you can see 1970. This goes way back. And so this was a major figure in the field of communication and rhetoric. And he just passed on, I think it was past June, thereabouts. The field was all abuzz with stories and fond memories of Herb Simons. I don't think I've ever met him myself, but he's well known. All right, so number 1 here on the notes, the nice thing about this reading is that it acknowledges the open, unpredictable, and highly dynamic nature of campaigns. The first few pages of this reading are really just pointing to all the different dynamics that one encounters when one is trying to understand and analyze a social movement, right? The members of a movement are dynamic in terms of like who knows who's participating, who knows who's involved at any given time. The purposes of a movement are dynamic in the sense that it's always changing. The message is changing, the goals are changing, and it's always changing in response to what's actually happening, right? The world itself is always evolving, and so social movements are always trying to, keep abreast with conditions as they evolve, with counter movements coming at them, with changes in the nature of the political landscape. A new president comes along, he's more sympathetic, she's less sympathetic. Change, adjust, right? And so there's dynamics internally, there's dynamics externally in terms of internal and external. There's kinds of always movement happening, right? And so he's starting off by noting just how difficult it is to try to pin down a social movement and say, all right, here's what it is. Because it's in the title, social movement. It's movement. It's always on the go, and it's always evolving. And I think what's important as we get into the definition here, number 3, but first let's look at number 2. The paper is aimed in a preliminary fashion at providing a leader-centric conception of persuasion and social movements. You can look at social movements in all different kinds of ways, in terms of the membership, in terms of alliances with other movements, in terms of the kind of discursive resources or the material resources, in terms of the geography, the reach, the uses of media, and on and on and on. This is focused on the leader, and that makes sense to me because it's hard to have a movement without some kind of a leader or a leadership, a group, one or two important folks who have taken upon themselves to just kind of grab the flag and run up the hill. And so this approach is looking at the challenges that are unique to the leadership of a social movement, right? All right, so number 3, actually it's number 4. Number 3 is the primary rhetorical test of the leader. All right, so what is the job? What is the rhetorical job? What's the persuasive objective? Or what's the goal of and for persuasion in a movement? Well, the primary rhetorical test of the leader and indirectly of the strategies he or she employs is his or her capacity to fill the requirements of the movement by resolving or reducing rhetorical problems. And so it's basically saying, look, any leader has certain rhetorical requirements, which is to fulfill the mission of the movement, the goals, the demands, the feeling that something needs to change, while overcoming constant problems, constant challenges. That's the task, is to try to, I think of it like, I don't know if you've ever been whitewater rafting, but you're, going down the river and you've got like all these rocks and these like cliffs and all that, and you're trying to like keep the thing on course. You're trying to navigate around the gnarliest stuff, right? So a leader of a movement's always trying to, move things through all the resistance and all of the, people who disagree with what you're doing are going to be trying to throw rebuttals in your way. They're going to be trying to, look for dirt on the leaders and like, look what they did. They were part of the opposite party 10 years ago. Like, they're a hypocrite. Always trying to navigate and manage your way around all of this turbulence, right? And to the extent that you are able to do that as a leader of a movement, then you have like fulfilled your rhetorical requirements, or you have satisfied the internal trajectory of the movement, right? All right, so number 4, a social movement may be defined. So this is 3, the top left there. Social movement may be defined, combining concepts, blah, 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 as an uninstitutionalized collectivity that mobilizes for action to implement a program for the reconstitution of social norms or values. All right, so the first important phrase there is uninstitutionalized collectivity. Now, it's super important for us to remember that social movements, just like public spheres or publics, they only exist because people want them to, right? They're voluntary. They're bottom up in the sense that they only exist because people come together out of their shared interests and frustrations, and people come together through no other reason than they all care about this. They all care about the environment, or they all care about the treatment of blank, or they all care about the conditions of blank, or they all care about the abuses or the corruption in blank organization or whatever. You follow, right? So everyone has a shared concern, frustration, and there's a shared investment or sense of interest here in terms of a problem, right? Or a perceived problem. And there's no institutional requirement that anyone be a part of this thing. That's like number one super important point here. When you're involved in a movement, you're not an employee, you're not a sister or a brother. I mean, maybe your siblings also participate, but that's not the capacity in which you are involved, right? You are doing this as a citizen, as a person, as a member of a community or communities, and you are moved by your very desire. We talked about desire. I think that was Wilbur. Desire, right? What's the wish? Yeah, the wish. For your wish for things to be different, to be better, to be more humane, more just, more fair, more equitable, more beautiful, more safe, whatever it is, right? Uninstitutionalized. It's bottom up. It's people coming together, banding together, showing up on a Saturday morning, taking time out of your otherwise kind of private, leisurely schedule. Why? Because you care, because you're angry, because you're frustrated, because you're mortified, because you're hurt, pissed off, suffering, ailing, whatever, right? Desire. And frustrated desire. You want things to be different, better, otherwise, and they aren't, and so you're going to involve yourself, self-directed. And so that's super important. Uninstitutional collectivity. It's a collective of who? People who care, people who join in of their own accord. That mobilizes for action. So again, that movement metaphor, mobilize, movement, right? So there's action, there's dynamism. To implement a program for the reconstitution of social norms or values. So the program is there's action, there's some kind of change that is being sought here, usually in the form of demands. We want this. We are tired of this. We are sick to death of this. We are not going to put up with this anymore. We want that. The wish, the desire, the yearning for something different, better, more, otherwise, right? That's the whole kind of energy behind the movement. So they're super important, and they exist all over the place. You can probably stop and think about many right now, whether it has to do with workers' rights, whether it has to do with environmental rights, animal rights, rights around sex and gender, rights around identity, rights around workers, about conditions in the workplace, and on and on and on and on. But the thing is not every movement's the same. They can be bigger, they can be smaller, they can be moving more urgently and more energetically, they can be moving slower and more calmly and languidly, right? It depends on this internal sense of urgency, the internal sense of rage and frustration, right? Lots of variables here, and that's what he's doing in this essay. He's trying to acknowledge the many different variables that any given social movement will be grappling with, but also trying to note the commonalities across the phenomenon itself. All right, so rhetorical requirements. Social, let's see here. Yeah, so the terminology in here, all the words, the suasive words, I was just noting, underlining some of these words here. Number one, they must attract. Leaders of social movements must meet a number of rhetorical requirements. They must attract. That's rhetorical, that's suasive, trying to bring people in. Maintain is to keep them sort of glued in, keep them sort of a energized member of the collective, and then mold, right? Attract, maintain, and mold. You're trying to create a sameness in terms of the future, in terms of where you're heading here. Number two is they must secure adoption. Now, number 5 here, I ABC'd the 1, 2, 3 here, and I was noting how the requirements have to do with, like, A has to do with internal requirements, right? Like keeping the membership kind of happy and energized and on board and kind of unified, right? Unity is important. Number 2 has to do with, like, the internal external. You're trying to take your vision of change, that's the product here. What does he say? They must secure adoption of their product by the larger structure. The product is this vision of change. We want better water. We want cheaper food, cheaper gas. We want cheaper rents. We are sick and tired of the conditions in the factory. We are sick and tired of the pollution in our water. So the product is the thing that you're trying to get the larger, wider population to accept, to buy into, to think about, to mobilize around, to join your cause on behalf of, all right? So that's number 2, or B. And then C is external, internal. So you're also dealing with the challenges that are coming from outside in. You have people out there who disagree. And that's the kind version. They can hate you. They can despise your very existence. They can be trying to thwart you and bump you off your course at all costs. They can be throwing money. They can be scandalizing you. They could be saying all kinds of nasty things about your leadership and about the basic premises of your product, your vision for change. So you got to deal with all of that. So the leaders of social movements have all these kind of rhetorical requirements. They got to be thinking about the internal kind of membership. They got to be thinking about the internal, external kind of relations and trying to get your word out. And then they also got to be dealing with challenges coming in. Those are 3 important kind of major arenas or dimensions to the job of a leader of a social movement, the rhetorical job. So at number 6 there, indeed, leaders of social movements can expect minimal internal control and maximal external resistance. Because your membership is volunteer, you can't require them to all do and think and say the same things. They're here of their own voluntary accord, right? They're here because they want to be. So you can't just push them around and cajole them and, like, intimidate and coerce. you have to work with the very people who you also need to help get the message out. But what happens if there's disagreements? What happens if there's disagreements in terms of where we're going or what audiences we're trying to reach or what the message is? Maybe it's not urgent enough. Maybe it's too urgent. Maybe it's too scaremongery. Maybe it's not trying to reach broadly enough. Maybe it's reaching too broadly, right? You got to manage all this as the leader of a movement. So minimal internal control and maximum external resistance. There could be money being spent to like create documentaries specifically trying to counter what it is you're doing. And so you're always kind of dealing with all this stuff internally, externally, and it's a lot. Yeah, the bottom there on page, the one that has rhetorical problems on it, page 4, bottom left. Whereas business corporations may induce productivity through tangible rewards and punishments, social movements as voluntary collectivities must rely on ideological and social commitments from their members. That's also suasory. That's also involves persuasion in terms of keeping people inspired, animated, excited, or angry, or aroused enough, attracted, and stay within this kind of, we're together. We got to stay together. If we don't stay together, we're going to all fall apart and then our cause is toast kind of thing. That's important. All right. Rhetorical problems, number 7. We just got problems and strategy left over here. And I'm not going to go through every little bit and piece, but rhetorical problems, number 7. There are several mentioned in the section. Note the theme of tension between going high and low rhetorically, right? So there's lots of, here I was thinking about Wolbert. I think you're going to want to make sure that you're good on Wolbert for this next test, those 3 levels, right? The bottom level is the private pathos motivational level. The middle level is the semi-private, semi-open level of ethos and authoritative kind of appeals. By the way, think about what we're talking about here. We're talking about leaders of social movements. So you can pretty much slot in Wolbert on ethos, what he says there. But he doesn't say that much about ethos, prestige, remember the whole prestige stuff and character and so on. This is a really important supplement to that second category. And then, of course, at the top, we've got the logos, substantive, and open category, right? This reading is largely in that middle space of the semi-open because we're dealing with, think about it, if you're a member of a movement, very likely you are frustrated by something that touches your personal private life, whether it be the treatment of animals or the treatment of the environment because you love nature and you're sick and tired of going out to Lake Mead and seeing trash everywhere, right? And so it's maybe starts in your private world, but now you want to kind of become part of this larger thing, right? But maybe you're not at that top level, again, Wolbert, the top level of logos and argument and da-da-da-da-da. So what he's saying here is, in terms of the rhetorical problems, is that there's a kind of tension between the levels as Wolbert describes, right? And so in the middle, in Wolbert's middle level, you would expect some combination of like private emotion and open public deliberative kind of reasons. But he acknowledges that social movements frequently are kind of compelled to go low, you know what I mean? Like literally low into that pathos motivational level. And we've got, we've got temptations to use, deceptive, coercive, manipulative kinds of strategies, scaremongering, fear-mongering, using caricatures of people, using kind of reductive scenarios, using like maybe strange analogies. You're dealing with larger populations, and when you're trying to reach broad audiences, you tend to, as we talked about, I can't remember which exact video, but you tend to kind of water down the message the broader out you go. And you also tend to inject it with a lot of pathos and emotion, right? And so he's noting some of the challenge here, that first dash on number 7, is social movements are heavily reliant on emotion and ideology and myth. They seem to just work better. Donald Trump is quite good at that level of broad, kind of mass appeal by using emotion and ideology. And now, a lot of leaders do, in fact, do that. Trump's just kind of more unique, let's say, with the starkness of his emotional, mythological appeals. Make America great again. That's this kind of mythological idea of the past. So some of the rhetorical problems or the challenges are, as a leader of a social movement, how you're always wanting to make the best possible argument you can make, that logos level, that substantive level, that cause effect, that rooted in reason level, but people don't tend to respond in the way you want them to at that high level. They tend to respond to authority. They tend to respond to personality. They tend to respond to values, to emotions, to sensations, to more emotional kind of appeals. And so, again, leaders must navigate and make choices, artful, inventive choices about, the uses of appeals, and again, thinking about different audiences as well. Number 5 there on the next page, next to the rhetorical strategies section, it says the leader must adapt to several audiences simultaneously. So complex, dynamic, movements are always kind of moving, going, and it's hard to manage them in the same way that we talked about with like a campaign, where you can think about kind of different phases and you can roll things out and you can be pretty directive and strategic. Now, you can't control everything, but a campaign is much more like pushed out in an intentional way, whereas a movement's just kind of a happening, a large scale happening where you have a few folks, maybe a central organization that's trying to move it all forward, but you have all this kind of messiness out in the fringes there, and it's just the nature of the phenomenon because you're dealing with people in their kind of capacity as volunteers, right? All right, so the last bit of this reading is on tactics or strategies, and he basically has the militant strategies and the moderate strategies, and then the indeterminate, which is in the middle. So it's an extension of what I was just saying. More militant strategies are obviously ones where the sense of urgency and frustration and even desperation might be very palpable. And so you're going to use different kinds of rhetorical tactics. You're going to use more fear-mongering, more deception, more coercion, more intimidation than maybe you even would want to, right? I'm working with a grad student, or have been for a while now, on writing an analysis of that movie called Mother. I don't know if anyone's seen it. It's like an environmental movie. It came out maybe like 7-10 years ago, something like that. And it's doing a lot of this kind of stuff in terms of using myth and analogy, and it's about a couple in their home, but he represents God and she represents Mother Earth. And then you have all these humans that come into their home and just trash the place, and it ends up getting kind of crazy. And the kind of point of the analysis of my student is to basically say, like, this is a really angry and desperate act of persuasion on behalf of the creator of the movie, to try to get people to see just how bad things are, just how desperate things are right now in terms of our climate situation. So when you feel yourself desperate, when you feel yourself running out of time and nothing's changing, you have to kind of use bolder, more aggressive rhetorical tactics. Whereas the moderate approach is like, hey, we're all friends here. There's not such a sense of urgency. Would you mind if we talked? Would you mind if I came in to your decision-making apparatus and tried to appeal to you on the reason level, right? So moderate is more about the kind of the top level of reason. Militant is those bottom levels of like rage and frustration and anger and resentment and all that kind of darker stuff. And that's kind of it, gang. And then intermediate strategies. He notes that intermediate strategies can kind of piss everyone off because you're neither militant nor moderate. You're kind of both. But he also acknowledges at the end there that an artful use of both can be the way to go, can be the way to succeed. The last page there, viewed broadly, the great contemporary movements all seem to require combinations of militant and moderate strategies. I think that probably makes good sense because a movement is so dynamic and complex. It can't always just be militant, or it can't just be moderate, because, it's going to exhaust its own resources, and it's probably out of step with things as they're actually evolving. It seems like there are times to be more urgent, times to be less urgent, and then the rhetorical strategies that you're drawing on are being driven by those senses, right? All right, so that is going to do it, I think, for social movements. We could spend a lot of time talking about social movements. I'm trying to just hit these key kind of areas of consideration for what persuasion is, how it operates, campaigns, social movements. After this unit, we're going to be moving into even more diffuse and more informal and implicit forms, or I'm sorry, semi-formal and suggestive. We're going to get into advertising and more kind of subtle stuff next week. So we have our next test coming up. Same approach. Let me know if you would like to chat about any readings, concepts, and so on. I'm always happy to. I'm here for you. And that's it for this weekend on social movement. So hope all's well, gang.